Side.
Good afternoon. I'm very excited to welcome you today to a session on how can we better actually address disaster risk finance, data and innovation to enable sustainable adaptation. This session is convened by MCRI, the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and the United Nations University, UNU. So calls for increasing investment in adaptation at a local scale are not a new thing. In 2010, at the Cancun Adaptation Framework, parties agreed that adaptation must be addressed at the same level of priority that mitigation. But this balance is very hard to achieve so far, and finance for adaptation continues to make up only for a small percentage of climate finance overall. It is about 20%. However, 2021 I've seen an increased commitment from the international community, especially from big international donors such as GCF or the World Bank, that have redirected their investment strategies to make funds available equally for mitigation and adaptation targets. This is especially true for those funds that are targeted at the most vulnerable population. This year, and it's important to cite that, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, was pleading all donors and multilateral development banks to allocate at least 50% of their climate support towards adaptation and resilience, and make it easier for countries affected by natural disaster to access this funding. So, but how is it actually feasible to address these needs for the most vulnerable when scarcity in data, access to data, and qualified personnel are common in many of these regions, making resource allocation for effective action even more challenging? How to support decision-making in a better way and to define adaptation strategies looking for financing options. This year, this moment, the COP26 is a pivotal moment to funnel resources towards adaptation, and especially in regions that are most affected. So today, with these excellent panelists that we have gathered today, I would like to see how we can actually use disaster risk finance, data and innovation in order to increase sustainable adaptation. My name is Maxime Souvignier, and I work for the United Nations University. And I'd like to introduce the panelists today, and I will start with you, Rosalind Cook. You work for the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, and you are the External Relations Officer for the Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia. Thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here, thank you.
So, but we have actually three more panelists today that are joining us virtually. And I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Emmanuel from the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. She's the team lead. And also Mr. Krishnan Narasimhan, which works for the UNCDF, the United Nations Capital Development Fund. He's a program manager for the Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program. And finally, this is my pleasure to introduce Debarati Gupta Sapir. She's the former director of the Center of Research of the Epidemiology and Disaster, the CRED, responsible for the MDAT database. And she's now a professor at the University of Louvain and also at the Johns Hopkins in the US. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today, virtually or in person. I'm very excited to kickstart this session. Looking forward to see how actually better risk finance, but also data and innovation can help achieve sustainable adaptation. So in order to do that, so we have a different format. So we would like to ask three main questions to the panelists, and the panelists will answer these questions with keywords one after the other. So I will start with the one of the three questions, and I'm going to spoil a bit all the questions by naming them at the beginning. So the first one is basically we are going to explore what is actually sustainable adaptation. How do the panelists coming from different backgrounds are defining that? That's the first question. The second question is actually what are the challenges linked with sustainable adaptation? What are the key challenges from your respective perspectives? That's the second question. And the third question is about implementation. Actually, do you have examples, best practices on how sustainable adaptation is or could be implemented? So as I said, we're going to answer these questions. The panelists will answer these sessions with keywords that they're going to post on Slido. I'd like to ask the audience to refrain from posting on Slido at the same moment. You will be given the opportunity to post your keywords at the end of the session. And after all the panelists have answered the questions, we will compile a joint statement during the session that we will give back to the panelists for commenting and also to the audience for commenting and enhancing, and then we will publish that on the website of the United Nations University just after this event. I'm very much looking forward to this very innovative setup for the workshop, and thanks my colleagues for preparing that. Without further ado, I think we'll start with the first question, and I will start with you, Rosalind. Can you give, from your perspective, a definition of sustainable adaptation?
Thanks, Maxime, and first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join your session today. Let me start with the keywords or type in afterwards, and then I'll explain why. So the keywords that I have chosen are multi-hazard, improved metrics, and to leave no one behind. And I think we see at UNDR sustainable adaptation very much linked in how we approach disaster risk reduction. And it really needs to balance the social, the environmental, and the economic elements to be really sustainable and to tackle elements like inequality at the same time. I think what we're seeing in the way that we need to tackle reducing the risk from disasters is that disasters have lots of different hazards, so we need to shift from a hazard by hazard approach to a multi-hazard approach, and I think that's an important element for sustainable adaptation. We need to have a comprehensive, holistic approach looking at the long term, and it needs to be based in good data, and for that we need to improve our metrics on that, and I'm sure we'll move into the discussion on the challenges and how we improve that. But I think, again, it's crucial that it leaves no one behind, and that sustainable adaptation has that as a fundamental principle running through it. It's quite noticeable that estimations, for example, estimate that by 2030 more than 1 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty because of climate change. And I think we've seen with the pandemic, what a big shock disaster can do. The World Bank, for example, has estimated that 97 million people were pushed into poverty because of that. So I think, this is what we need to tackle when we tackle sustainable adaptation, is to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind, that we have a particular focus on the most vulnerable groups and those most at risk.
So, keywords, what are your top 5 keywords?
Multi-hazard,
leave
no one behind. I think I've got 6 there, but those are my... I can squish multi-hazard into one word.
Exactly, we could accept that as a word. So
that.
Multi-hazard and leave no one behind. All right. So I think we have that in on Slido and in the cloud. And I think I will move to our second panelist, Elisabeth Emmanuel. Can you hear me? And I'd like to hear from you, maybe first your keywords, and maybe shortly an explanation of your choice of your keywords before we move to our next panelist. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having Chris on this panel. My keywords are committed climate insurer, and I have five words, and financial protection. So I'm going to focus my response on what sustainable adaptation means to Chris. And really and truly, it's about helping our members recover faster after natural disasters, build forward stronger and more equal to be able to effectively adapt to future climate related and other natural hazards. We are a parametric insurance facility and recognize that parametric insurance and other disaster risk financing tools provide resources to address loss and damage caused by the impacts of climate change, which inevitably will occur despite the best mitigation and adaptation efforts. These limitations to mitigation and adaptation, we feel call for an increased role in disaster risk financing, and we need to ensure that this occupies a dominant space on national, regional agendas with development partners. What we need to recognize is that following these natural disasters, if we are to sustainably adapt, our experience has shown that regardless of economic indicators such as GDP growth, GDP per capita, etc., and the wealth of a country, quick liquidity within 2 weeks of a disaster is critical. Critical because it's needed to support the most vulnerable and near vulnerable in populations with things like food, water, medicines, but also to get critical services up and running. We think that without adequate financial protection strategies, such as parametric insurance, catastrophe events really jeopardize governments' abilities and efforts to end poverty through shared prosperity, while threatening to reverse hard-won development gains over the years. And it really does push countries further away from enhancing their resilience to leave disasters behind, advance the SDGs towards leaving no one behind. So that's it in a nutshell.
I was expecting a bit that you would say that insurance or risk transfer plays a great role in
yes, so that's what, yeah, we're talking about parametric insurance.
Sustainable adaptation. I think we have your keywords on Slido, so it's already in the cloud, and I will move on to the next speaker, Krishnan. Can you hear us? And would you like to share us your keywords for the definition of sustainable adaptation and shortly explain why you chose these ones?
Thanks, Maxim. Thanks, organizers and participants for this opportunity. I will define sustainable adaptation from the point of view of the UNCDF Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program that I represent. The program's overall objective is to improve the financial preparedness and resilience of Pacific governments and communities, specifically vulnerable segments of society and economic sectors towards climate change and natural hazards. At the outset, we recognize that sustainable adaptation is possible only by the coordinated and concerted efforts of multiple stakeholders. In other words, no institution or intervention can be seen from a siloed perspective. The program I represent by design focuses on agriculture, fisheries, retail, and tourism sectors that account for nearly about 80% of the populations in these livelihood sectors of the populations of these markets. There's a cross-cutting focus on women, youth, migrants, small businesses, and people with disabilities. So therefore, at the outset, by design, we are very inclusive in our approach. The market-based parametric microinsurance solutions and products that we are developing and we have developed and piloted aim to reduce the vulnerabilities of low-income populations by providing immediate cash payments post-extreme weather events, which helps in faster recovery and building long-term resilience. the ultimate goal, as we see as a sustainable adaptation, is to ensure that these products are inclusive. They are co-created with the end beneficiary, and therefore, like to me, the key words are financial preparedness and inclusive innovation. And a market-based approach is more sustainable, since a subsidized form of intervention may not survive, like political changes may not survive donor support over over a long period, and our approach is totally market-based. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Krishnan, for your keywords and also explaining why you are standing to them. So I think there is it could be another session on subsidies, on risk transfer solutions or financial solutions. But I find that extremely interesting that that you are promoting the inclusiveness also of the private sector in order to make basically adaptation solutions sustainable. This is something which is very novel and which does not happen on a regular basis right now, especially in the international community. That's really nice, very nice perspective. I think I also really enjoyed the part with the stakeholder engagement. So without ownership from the beneficiaries of any solutions for adaptation, there is very few schemes that might last longer than actually the timeline or the life of the project. Thank you very much. I will now move to our next, last but not least, panelist, Debbie Guasapir from the University of Louvain, and you are the former director of MDAT. Could you give us, from your perspective, a few keywords on defining sustainable adaptation, and also explain briefly, like the other panelists did, why you chose this perspective and these keywords? I think we cannot hear you, Debbie. I can see you very well on camera, but it seems there is. Can
you hear me now?
Yes, now it's working. Excellent.
Good. It's very simple. I was on mute.
Happens to me all the time. Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. So thank you for inviting me to the panel. I am actually, as you probably have guessed, I'm a data person. And I really look at quality of data and whether or not the data on disaster impacts, both on a global level and a local level, is sufficiently good. But I will speak on that later on in one of the other two questions. As far as your question is concerned, the sustainable adaptation, it's not directly in my area of expertise. Many of the other panel members are experts in this kind of a subject. I have two comments to make on this. One is that sustainable adaptation, actually, the measures that has to be taken for sustainable adaptation, I think the onus or the burden of the volume of the measures or the efforts made, and this is going to be a little hard for many people to take, but the onus of the burden of the measures for sustainable adaptation has to really rest on the shoulders of the OECD countries. So in other words, the developed world, the industrialized world. Those are the countries who are actually still today responsible for the largest number of emissions in the totality of in the global picture. In addition to that, there is China and India who add to this, and in fact, I think one of the two countries is actually the absolutely largest responsible for the global warming emissions, the CO2 emissions. I think I would offer that sustainable adaptation, whatever the measures are, I'm not going to go into details of this measure or that measure, the burden has to be on the countries that are the biggest emitters. And that we are not yet there. We are not yet there in COP26. I don't know that when we are going to be there, but this has got to be one of the main thrusts of the global community to be able to push this through. That if you're the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide and so on and so forth, you have to also carry the great. Is that any kind of adaptation measures should focus on, and this is a bit of a utopic thing to say, but anyway, I'll say it, should focus on ensuring that there is not a net depletion of natural resources. And this is not, it's a very difficult thing because, whatever you do, somehow, if you look at the whole model and things, you're going to find that whatever we do to go into economic development, economic growth, there will be some kind of a bad effect. But somehow we have to understand that we have to weigh the measures we take for development and the cost to the environment and come to some kind of a trade-off which balances it off. And the last comment I would make is related to this trade-off between economic growth and environmental costs, is that the costs for environmental costs linked to economic growth should not be entirely on the shoulders of the global south. Because at the end of the day, as we all know very well, that the global north has actually enriched itself by through a very high cost to the environment, very high cost for decades, not for some years, for decades. And it is very difficult to convince, in reality, it's very difficult to convince the global south today to say that, sorry, you have to cut down on this, that, and the other, because we don't want the global environment to be destroyed. And that has to be one of the most important components, understanding of the sustainable adaptation.
Thank you very much. That's actually really interesting that you are addressing the definition of sustainable adaptation from the loss and damage debate perspective with global South and OECD countries, but also from the perspective on a trade-off between what are the environmental costs and economic costs, so development versus adaptation versus environment in order to define sustainable development. We have to make sure we have these keywords inside the cloud with Slido, but I think we do, and I think we are actually good to go for the second round of questions. For the sake of time, I think I have to ask you to keep the justification a bit shorter, and I'll try to talk less as well. The second question, Rosalind, for you, maybe skipping the keywords, but can you tell us, from your perspective, from the perspective of the UNDRR and risk management, what are the key challenges to address sustainable adaptation? In 2-3 sentences. 2-3 sentences,
sure. Let me highlight three areas, and my key words, I know you asked me not to say it, but I'll keep it short, would be good data and political leadership, because I think some of the key challenges that we see is first overcoming silos and having an integrated approach. So in disaster risk reduction, we work mainly with civil protection authorities, ministries of interior, national disaster management agencies, who have disaster risk reduction strategies. Ministries of environment have climate change adaptation strategies. All of these are based on data and metrics continuously improving. We need to leverage that a lot strongly together to have an integrated approach. There's a lot of work happening here, but I think we need more innovation and thinking about how to bring the two communities together and to learn from each other, particularly around tackling multi-hazard risk. I think
basically that's multi-hazards, multi-actors, and one of the key challenges from your perspective, talking about management, is how do we bring all these together?
How do we bring it together? And I think, how do we bring in effectively the degrees of climate risk and what that means for increased disasters? Everything in Glasgow is focused, well, not everything, but a huge focus is on keeping 1.5 degrees alive. And that's really important for disaster risk reduction community, because we need to better understand how each fraction and increase in every degree of risk for climate change, what that means for increased disasters, and how to manage and reduce that risk comprehensively. 1.5, if we get to 1.5, that still means a huge increase in disasters. Civil protection authorities at the moment are often becoming quite overwhelmed by the scale of disasters that we already face from climate impacts. So I think this is the degrees of risk is a key challenge that I think we need to work more on. And if I can connect to the finance that you mentioned earlier, data and finance, I think we also need to get better at understanding the real world, monitoring and evaluating the real world impact of investments in disaster resilience, because that is very challenging. And with the disaggregated data that we need better information on, disaggregated data on losses by locality, by gender, by vulnerable groups, to help us better understand, where to make the investments, what works, what doesn't. Those are key challenges for us that we need to work more on.
No, that's very interesting to see then exactly this perspective on maybe you wanted also to address when adaptation becomes maladaptation, so basically when you have some negative effect on some of the measures applied, etc., and how to monitor all that is of course very difficult.
Yeah, that's right.
I think I move to our next speaker, Elizabeth. For the same reasons, for time constraints, I'd like to ask you to answer the questions about the key challenges to the implementation of sustainable adaptation in a few sentences.
All right. Well, the challenges and my keywords here would be scaling up and capacity. But the challenges that we face, for example, is inadequate fiscal space of governments, reducing their ability to make the necessary investments in ex-ante disaster risk financing instruments or risk transfer within the context of risk layering, including contributing to microinsurance or inclusive insurance. These limited resources of our governments also reduce their ability to purchase adequate cover. For example, in the case of CRIF, whilst we may offer coverage of up to 150 million per peril, they are not purchasing enough to meet their needs or purchasing less than adequate cover, below the 25% recommended ceding percentage or the amount of risk, in other words, the amount of risk that they transfer to CRIF. In some cases, we have countries having a ceding percentage of 4.5%. One of the things that we actually need is donor support for the development of new parametric products to cover additional perils and economic sectors, such as drought, public sector assets, and infrastructure, including housing stock. But beyond CRIF itself and risk transfer, one of the other challenges includes things like the limited capacity of governments in our region to make their social protection policies more shock responsive. And there is not enough recognition of the role that social protection can play in scaling up efforts towards things like making inclusive insurance more accessible. Our per capita incomes in developing countries are pretty low, and insurance penetration rates are also low. And much of this is due to both per capita incomes, but also a low level of understanding of how insurance works. In many cases, another challenge is the legal regulatory systems, which needs to be amended to, for example, facilitate the inclusion of inclusive insurance and other insurance products. Another area, for example, for us is the role of the private sector and they tend not to be active players in markets such as the microinsurance markets, or even there are not products available, for example, to help the private sector protect loan portfolios. The linkages between the private sector and civil society organizations with respect to risk transfer and inclusive insurance is also weak. And additionally, our local authorities and municipalities and NGOs do not always have the capacity to be key players in areas such as inclusive insurance, or for developing models such as community-based microinsurance models, whereby your local communities or your NGOs develop and distribute these products to communities, managing these smaller risk pools, etc. So these are some of the, we have several challenges, but these are some of them that I'd like to share.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit depressed now. It sounds like so many challenges actually for implementation of insurance. But I actually completely share your view. So the literacy, finance literacy, insurance literacy is definitely an issue when it comes to beneficiaries, but also in governments. And then because when we talk about sovereign insurance or sovereign risk transfer like the one CRIF provides, or micro insurance, it's definitely something which is very difficult. And I also remember what you said about the entry points for the private sector, which is also answering to what Krishnan said before, with integration of the private sector being the key of the definition of sustainable adaptation. Yeah, thank you very much. But I think that's these things are actually it's achievable to address these issues, but it's a lot of work to be done on a regular basis. And I'd like to have your opinion on that, Krishnan, on if you share these views or if you see additional challenges when it comes to sustainable adaptation. Again, like for the other panelists, in a few sentences.
Yeah, thanks. So I largely agree with what Liz has just mentioned. In addition, for us in the Pacific, there are other challenges around low populations, geographical remoteness, poor infrastructure, connectivity, and of course the limited technical and financial capacities at all levels. There are, of course, several supply and demand side challenges as well, and then insurance penetration, even for the traditional insurance, is quite limited. Even it's only about 15% in the most advanced countries in the region. Climate risk insurance, so far till our intervention, was almost non-existent. There were very little market-based solutions. And due to a combination of social and economic considerations, and with the challenges I mentioned above, all this was not possible. Then there was limited private sector appetite, because you are telling them to change their business models. They have been doing things in a particular way for the last 25, 30 years, and suddenly you're asking them to change their business models. That takes quite a lot of time, effort, and building their technical capacities. And most importantly, especially in market-based solutions that we are promoting, consumer empowerment is perhaps the key. Building the financial capacity and competency of the end user or the beneficiary is key to sustainable use of these products. If you want to build use cases, then you have to have competent customers who understand what their risk profile is, what their risk exposure is, and why like insurance instruments are good for their risk protection. So behavioral change in consumers and how they deal with risk and look at financial protection is extremely vital, and to me that is the key. The implementation of a program of the type that I mentioned, the PCAP, needs a lot of technical and financial resources. while UNCDF has the technical resources, both in terms of insurance and in terms of digital last mile interventions, we definitely need financial sort of resources. And though I must thank and sort of acknowledge the contributions of our key donors, namely the governments of Australia, New Zealand, India, and Luxembourg, we still have a long way to go. We have just piloted the early interventions. There is opportunity to replicate, scale within the Pacific and beyond, and all this needs, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of climate finance to flow, especially towards adaptation measures. I'm very optimistic that the ongoing sort of dialogue at COP will open more doors for us. So to me, in addition to the challenges mentioned earlier, the key challenges are, of course, consumer empowerment and stakeholder coordination. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Krishnan, for then adding these points. I couldn't agree more, actually. And I'd like to see what you think about that, Debbie, from the perspective of data. And again, maybe just a few sentences so we can address the last question before wrapping up.
Yeah, so I have 2 points to make for this, the key challenges. There are 2 challenges from what I can see. And it's sort of more or less implicitly mentioned by people and explicitly actually mentioned by the previous people. One is that we have to somehow, and we are not doing it really well, and that's why I call it a challenge, we have to somehow move down from stratospheric levels to much more community, much more local levels. And when I say stratospheric, I mean literally, both literally and intellectually stratospheric. We have not done very well at all in all the climate change. I've been to the previous COPs and so on and so forth. I'm not in Glasgow now. We have not done well at all in trying to bring the whole problematic down to community or local levels, which means that we will never bring the people along with us in these movements, which require a sustained support of the people around the world. And if the communities are not engaged, if the local municipalities are not engaged, this is simply not happening. And if we stay at the global level, if we stay at the stratospheric level, that's going to be a problem now for a long time to come. That's one. The second challenge is that we also need to have, and this Krishnan just mentioned, and I have thought about this before, but I think he put it very clearly and very, very practically. We need to find solutions that have some kind of a tangible benefit within a reasonable time frame, within a time frame of a person's lifetime. So I don't think it's reasonable to say, yeah, we're going to do all of this, we're going to tighten our belts, we're going to walk on hot coals and so on and so forth, and you guys have to do it, you have to do all of this. But you will see the benefits in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 100 years. This will appeal to no one. And everyone will say, yes, 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 but this is going to appeal to no one. We need to have measures. The challenge is that we need measures where the people around the world, the people who are most in the front lines of this climate change, see the benefits within their lifetime and possibly even less. And that challenge, I don't see anybody actually thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is actually a point we haven't addressed before. So we addressed the one with the how to reach actually the beneficiaries, poor and vulnerable people that are very often the most affected and the hardest to reach. But the timeline issue, we haven't addressed that before. So how to make adaptation appealing and more visible, and it has to happen in a lifetime. It's an excellent point, and maybe it leads also to the next question we have, which is: do we have actually examples of implementation of sustainable adaptation? And I'd like to ask all of you panelists to name just one example very shortly, so that we have time then to wrap up everything and then just to discuss shortly the statement afterward. So I'll start again with you, Rosalind. What would be one example very shortly, and thank you.
Thanks. One example, and I take the opportunity of being in the EU pavilion to talk about an EU initiative, which I think is the way that the EU is recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic damages, specifically the Next Generation EU, with an expenditure of over 700 billion going for the economic recovery, but with a strong focus on a green and resilient recovery. And it demonstrates that where there's political will and acts on evidence and science, you can actually make a change towards sustainable adaptation. The fact that 37% is earmarked to green spending is really significant, and I think this program rolling out over the next 5 years will be crucial for sustainable adaptation and for learning from this region, but also applying those lessons globally. So I think let's watch that very carefully.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, very great example from the EU, and then I'm moving to the Caribbean with Elizabeth. And then do you have an example that you can name us? Just one that you think suits the definition of sustainable adaptation? I think you're muted, or we cannot hear you.
Sorry.
Thanks.
I
Perfect.
think I'd like to mention the climate risk adaptation and insurance in the Caribbean project, the CRATE project, which CRIF is implementing in partnership with the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. And I'd like to look at that within the context of sustainable adaptation, because of the promise it holds for vulnerable persons in the Caribbean, helping them to better absorb the climate shocks that they're exposed to, but also has a huge potential to help our vulnerable persons recover faster and to make that recovery more equal because of the emphasis on women, girls, and other vulnerable groups in our society. I think inclusive insurance and the role that it plays with respect to social protection and shock responsive social protection and adaptive social protection is also key. And the link with this particular project and disaster risk management and climate change adaptation projects on the ground is also something that I would like to point out, because on one hand, there is insurance, but there has to be the notion of building resilience. And I think this project holds a lot of promise to do a lot of the things that we want to do and to change the lives of vulnerable and near vulnerable persons in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this example. I think we now I'll move to Krishnan for another short example that's in your opinion is highlighting sustainable adaptation.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just briefly tell you about what we have done so far and how we feel that this is creating pathways to sustainable adaptation. So at the outset, at the beginning of this program, which was launched late last year and it started implementation from this year, we have done a lot of foundational research leading into the product development. So which means that a lot of the target beneficiaries were covered in the fundamental research that led to the actual product development. During the product development, the beneficiaries were involved in the co-creation of the product, as well as the potential channel partners like cooperatives and agri agencies were also involved in the product development. So therefore, we went through something called the decision gate. One is there a demand? Is there a financial feasibility? And will it make a business case for the private sector? So these were the three questions that went into like developing the program. So which means that the ultimate beneficiaries were part of the problem identification, solution development, and they are also now part of the implementation. So therefore, we feel that this would lead to sustainable adaptation, because this is something that is rooted in solid data. It is rooted in good research. Development of the solution has been done with the participation of the beneficiaries, the channel partners, and to ensure last mile reach using UNCDF's expertise and experience in developing digital solutions. Right from the beginning, we have gone for digital interventions, which means that the client onboarding, the transfer of data from the field to the insurance company onwards to the reinsurer, and then again linkages to the mobile wallets, all ensure a very robust ecosystem where like what digital interfaces play a very vital role in the delivery of the solution, keeping the cost down and adding value to the whole thing. So I feel strongly that these two are going to ensure or are actually creating pathways for sustainable adaptation. And I mean, like while the future will validate our hypothesis, I strongly feel that we will be justified in doing what we are in the years to come. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Krishnan. Indeed, I think also that digitalization is definitely one of the enabler of the pathway for sustainable adaptation. Before we wrap up, I'd like to have from you, Debbie, one example from your perspective, from the perspective of data, of sustainable adaptation. Very shortly, so we have time to wrap up afterwards.
Yes. So, I'll come back. This is going to sound a bit like from the sublime to the ridiculous, but I come from a very strong field background. Most of my academic work is in the field. So most recently, I've been working in the last 2 years or 3 years, I've been working on heat waves, because I can see it coming is one of the biggest challenges linked to meteorological conditions that we have to face, and which has going to be responsible for many deaths, not just a few. For heat waves, I work with an NGO, an Indian NGO. Well, it's now become an Asian NGO, but an NGO. And I was in one of the slums, urban slums in Dhaka and in Delhi. And they have, for heat waves, for instance, they have some really very good and practical, very good in the sense very effective, good is a relative term, very effective solutions for heat management in the slum housing, which are incredibly dense. They're usually one room with one very small window, and the woman sits there and cooks with her little baby tied to her in that one room for the whole day. Now, what they have done is they have started a kind of an RCT type thing, but which is coming out really well, with trying to have different housing design, this single room design, to improve ventilation and to ensure a cooling down of the nighttime temperatures. As many of you know, the change in the nighttime temperature is absolutely critical for mortality and morbidity, heat-related mortality. This is critical, 10 degrees. You have to have a 10-degree drop when you have. And so they are trying out different options of using used eggshell containers, of having green walls, and so on and so forth. I don't know, there's just about 5 different options to see whether housing can be changed, housing design can be changed, and material subsidized to be able to improve ventilation and temperatures, internal temperatures. That, to me, is the kind of solutions we need. We need solutions that actually have an impact on people and on people's lives. And until we have those kinds of solutions, we're not going to go in. So that's an example that I thought I'd bring to the table.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very concrete example on hazard, heat wave that is not usually addressed or less than flood or drought internationally. So it puts some focus on that. I think now that we have discussed the question of how to define sustainable adaptation, and also what are the key challenges and some examples, I think we can come up with a wrap-up, a statement, very shortly, if technically feasible. And I think what I would offer is that we would discuss that with the panelists afterwards, after the session, before posting that on the posting online for time concerns. So can we have the statement on the screen? I see. Yes. So that's a statement that we have done with all the keywords that we have received from the panelists so far on Slido, and the team, technical team and thematic team, they have worked on a statement during the presentation, and we should be able to present that on the screen. So if it's not working, what I would propose is we can move on to the next item in the presentation, and I would suggest that we will post and discuss this statement with all the panelists and publish that on the website of the United Nations University. That's what happened when you are working with innovation. Sometimes innovation is getting in the way. All right, that was a good example of that. So, exactly. So we have one last item on the agenda, and I'd like to take the few minutes we have before closing the session to announce and actually launch network, community of practice, which is based on a framework which it's called the Economics of Climate Adaptation Framework, in short, ECA. And this community of practice is called the ECA network. And we would like to invite all of you participants, but also panelists, to join this network, which is actually built around a very innovative tool, the Economics of Climate Adaptation. It's powered by a software, a model, Climada, that is actually bridging between data, adaptation, modeling, private sector, donors, multi-stakeholder, multi-hazard approach. It's a bridge between data and finance. It enables working with different stakeholders to prioritize between different adaptation measures at a lot of different levels. It has been applied in more than different countries, and it comes actually from the reinsurance industry, and it has been transformed, tweaked in order to serve the purposes of climate adaptation over the last years. We have been very active with UNU, but also ETH University, but also Frankfurt School, KfW, and other donors, ISF, in trying to develop this network. And today we would like to officially launch it. And before that, we have a short video that we would like to share with you. If it's, again, I've seen that before, technically feasible.
Extreme weather events threaten urban and rural areas, from small regions to entire nations. The Economics of Climate Adaptation, in short ECA, offers a unique framework for the flexible identification of cost-effective climate adaptation measures. Understanding climate risk is the first step in developing an effective adaptation strategy. Decision makers face the following questions. What are our climate risks today and in the coming decades? How can we deal with these risks, and which adaptation measures are appropriate? Which investments are necessary, and do the benefits outweigh the costs? ECA, together with Climada, an open-source modeling platform, helps to answer these questions. Climata simulates the impact of thousands of hazard events on assets and people, taking into account their vulnerabilities. It provides a robust analysis of the costs and benefits of adaptation, supporting decision makers with a fact base to design their adaptation strategy. Adding national and local knowledge further improves the quality of Climata's outputs. Climata's output can be customized to cover the needs of a variety of stakeholders. By using these outputs, the economics of climate adaptation supports decision makers in unlocking climate finance and developing national adaptation plans or NAPs and other adaptation strategies such as ecosystem-based adaptation, infrastructure, community-based adaptation, or risk transfer. These outputs make a strong case for climate action, as it is often less costly to start adapting now rather than waiting. So take action now. Please visit eca-network.org for more information on the economics of climate adaptation.
Thank you very much. So I would again ask all the panelists, but also all participants that are interested in participating in this network to join actually the, this community of practice, which is very appealing because it's open source, and we have already UN institutions participating, but also universities, academia, and also the private sector. And it has been shown that it enables to involve multi-hazards, but also, as you said before, then also a multi-stakeholders to bring them at the table for the first time. Yeah, thank you very much. And now, before closing this session, I have been told that we have now access to the final statement, and I think you can see that on your screens. Bear with me, I have to read that. And I would shortly show this statement. I don't think we have a lot of time to really discuss that, but I'd like to invite the audience, if you would like to add using the EU Slido address, then add some keywords that we can add to the statement. You can do that, and we will make sure we will introduce that. Very shortly, I think, because you are here, I'd like to ask you, Rosalind, what is your impression on the statement? I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No, of course, if it's possible to put the statement back, but I think the statement actually captures really well the conversation that we've had across this meeting, and I think from the examples that all of the speakers have given, it's quite clear that investment in prevention saves lives, investment pays off, it can deliver sustainable adaptation.
Thank you very much. I really like it as well, especially the part on breaking the silos. I think it's keeping things together. As I said, we will then reflect on that with all the panelists, and also take participants if you want to join us. You can actually find our details then below. I think not on this one, but then. In the, if you go, for instance, on the website for the ECA network, then you can find our contact details, and then we'll come back to you on this one. I think it will be published next week, around next week, on the UNU website. Again, thank you very much to all panelists that have joined you today. So Rosalind Cook from UNDRR, that you made that in person today. Thank you very much. But also to all the other panelists that took the time and the effort of preparing also for this session, especially to Elizabeth, Emmanuel from CRIF, Krishnan Narasimhan from the UNCDF, and Debbie Gouda-Sapir from the University of Louvain. Again, thank you very much. Wish you a very good afternoon.